everybody. Just to kind of start things off, when you get into class tomorrow, you will each grab two of what you're seeing on the screen right now, these Hippo primary source analysis worksheets. And based off of that, obviously you can tell that today we will be talking about analyzing primary sources. So we're going to look at the Hippo method, which stands for the anagram. It stands for historical context, intended audience, point of view, purpose, and outside information. And we'll use this to kind of take a look at some primary sources. All right. But first off, before we go into that, let's just do a kind of quick refresher on what a primary source even is. All right, just in case you don't remember. All right. So a primary source is essentially a document or object or what have you that was created at the time that you are studying. So you have stuff like translations, excerpts, diaries, transcriptions of speeches, letters, interviews, newscasts, news articles, or newspapers, all sorts of different things, autobiographies, first-hand accounts. All these sorts of things are primary sources. So stuff that was written by people who were actually alive at the time, witnessing an event and describing at least some aspect of it, right? You're not going to get a whole picture of an event just from one or two sources, but you put enough little pieces together, you'll eventually start to see the whole picture. So that's kind of the building blocks for how we're going to kind of look at a lot of events. All right, and along with that, you also have secondary sources, and secondary sources are things that you create using primary sources, essentially, right? It's what you're going to be creating when you write research papers. So a secondary source is they interpret and analyze primary sources, like we're going to be doing today, and they're one or more steps removed from the event. So it's a historian writing about an event, or let's go maybe a reporter who's writing about an event, but they didn't witness the event themselves, they're just describing what they heard, right? So that can be a secondary source. So secondary sources are things created using primary sources, so stuff like books, magazines, textbooks, encyclopedias, right? Whereas primary sources are the artifacts that we actually look to. So original documents, speeches, diaries, etc. All right, and the one that we are going to look at today, just to kind of go through a background of what you're going to be expected to do tomorrow in class. So tomorrow in class, the first source we'll do it together, just so I can make sure that you guys paid attention during this video. Make sure you all have the process kind of in your heads. And then for the second source we look at tomorrow, I will kind of set you off on your own for you to do it yourself. All right, so that's how tomorrow is going to play out. As far as today, so let's look at the source we're going to analyze today. All right. So we're gonna stick to a theme of the American Revolution just to keep things consistent for this class as far as primary sources go. So this is essentially a news leaflet. So back in the American Revolution, at the time of colonial America, news was spread through leaflets. So you would take a piece of paper, write what you wanted, print it, and then just put these leaflets up on billboards or walls, poster boards across the city. And that's how people shared news, any sorts of community news, job postings, and anything that you wanted the community to be aware of or know of. You would pretty much put on these leaflets and kind of get it out there if you wanted to spread the word. So looking at this is called To the Free Men of America. All right, so let's look back at the Hippo primary source analysis. So the first thing we're going to want to know is kind of look at the historical context. So we want to figure out when the source was created, what was happening when this source was created, and how knowing the time period help us understand the document. All right, so let's go back to it. Now, ignore this 1773. Someone, probably a archivist, put that there. But how do we know that this was created in 1773? Because the author never explicitly tells us throughout all of this. I'm not going to read this whole thing because we don't really need to read the whole thing to analyze it for the information that we need. But we'll go through bits and pieces to get what we need. He never outright tells us that it's 1773, but this is essentially arguing against, if you read it closely, he is, in the first couple sentences, he says that the duty imposed by the Act of Parliament on tea imported here will be paid in London. So he's talking about a tax on tea. So we're studying tax on tea around the American Revolution. So obviously this is in reaction to the Tea Act, right, which was passed in 1773. So this kind of takes a little bit of further research. It takes a little bit of extra effort. And it's not every little bit of information that we're going to look for is always going to be obvious on these sources. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of detective work in order to find the answers to these. And sometimes you can't find the answers to these. Sometimes it's impossible to tell exactly when a source was created or who created the source, right? But do your best, all right? And in this case, using context clues, we're able to tell that this was written in 1773, sometime in 1773, as a response to the Tea Act, right? He's writing about essentially the Tea Act, describing it in that, all right? So, historical context. That's when it was created. 1773, leading up to the American Revolution, which kind of kicks off in 1775. So it's only 2 years before the American Revolution, right? So that's what's happening when the source was created. You're having this buildup of tension between the colonists and Great Britain that will eventually break out into war. But at this time, it hasn't really reached that peak yet, right? They're still kind of going back and forth over these taxes on different products. This time it's tea, right? So how does this time period help you understand the document, right? Well, we know at this point it's 1773, tensions are high. England has already passed several acts imposing taxes on different goods. People are getting tired of it, right? So you can understand the author's point of view, right? This just another tax in a long line of taxes. When is it going to stop? That's kind of the perspective the author kind of is taking in this, right? So that's how knowing the time period can help us understand where the author is coming from in this. So as far as historical context, source was created in 1773, sometime pretty soon after the Tea Act was passed. What was happening? The build-up to the American Revolution, and how does this time period help you understand the document? The author of this document has gone through a series of different acts passed by Parliament taxing different products and tension between England and the U.S., all right? Intended audience. A little bit more obvious in this, right? So he is saying right there in his first couple of words, to the free men of America, my dear countrymen. So he is writing to American colonists, right? That is for who the source was created, all right? So he's writing that, and how do we know? Because he says it right there. To my fellow countrymen, to the free men of America, right? And how does this impact the author's message? He's trying to inform the free men of America, his countrymen, of what Parliament is doing with the Tea Act, right? But he's going to tailor the way he presents the Tea Act in a way that'll get his countrymen riled up. And we'll kind of talk about that when we get further down into the purpose, right? So his intended audience is his countrymen, right? So he's going to try to be getting his countrymen riled up about the Tea Act. Okay. All right. So that's intended audience. Point of view is a little bit trickier for this one, right? Point of view. He does not sign it with his name. If you go down here, it is signed Mucius, or however you pronounce it in Latin, right? A lot of times, and you see this even with like Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, which we'll talk about much later. When you don't want your name to be attached to a document, colonists tended to sign with Latin names, kind of harkening back to like a Roman imperial kind of vibe, all right? And why would he not want to put his name on this? Well, very openly throughout this, he is criticizing Great Britain's Tea Act, right? And if you're criticizing Great Britain, you don't necessarily want your name to be put out there because you don't want to get caught up in it. You might not want to get arrested or fined or whatever the British would do to him. So he signs it under a Latin pseudonym. All right, so we don't really know exactly who wrote this. All right, so we don't know the author. What do we know about the author? Well, we know that he is probably an American colonist, probably a merchant who is either affected by the Tea Act or somebody who buys a lot of tea and maybe impacted by the Tea Act. Right? Or maybe even just a political activist who is just sick and tired of all of the taxes being thrown at them. All right. So, point of view: an anonymous American colonist, probably an upper-class merchant who is affected by the Tea Act. All right. Moving on, because we're getting a little bit short on time with this video. Purpose. If you go into here, as far as purpose goes, the first thing you want to look for really is a call to action, right? And in this, you don't really find a call to action until the end, right? So if you see right here where he says, Americans must refuse to purchase the noxious weed, referring to tea, and such refusal will make it infamous and dangerous for any man or any set of men to aid or abet its introduction and sale. All right, so right there is his call to action. He's calling on his countrymen, free men of America, to stop buying tea in response to the Tea Act. Right, so that is his purpose. Right, that is the entire point. He's not writing to entertain. He is writing to inform. Right, to get describe what the Tea Act does. He says, up here he describes how the British say the Tea Act is going to work, and then he argues why he doesn't necessarily agree with their point of view for how it would work. And you also get this call to action, right? You have this call to action to stop buying tea in response, right? So that's his purpose. Okay? And outside information. So what other historical knowledge or documents can we use in addition to this to kind of understand this whole Tea Act going on, right? Obviously, the first one to go to, you can read the Tea Act, right? You can actually go to the Tea Act, read it, and see whether or not Mucius's criticisms stack up, right? You can kind of look at it and tell whether or not he is giving an accurate representation of what the Tea Act is and what it does or doesn't do, all right? So the Tea Act is probably going to be the huge one as far as outside information goes, all right? So just kind of quick recap before we end off the video. Historical context, you're going to want to know when the source was created, what was happening when the source was created, all right? Intended audience, who is the source being created for? How do we know this? Point of view. Who is the author? What do we know about the author? How do we know this about the author? Purpose. Why did the author create the source, right? Is he trying to just entertain people? Is he trying to just record an event? Is he trying to